Let's review a debate between Slavoj Žižek and Bernt Peterson, entitled Happiness, Capitalism versus Marxism. As usual, we will display the abstract argument patterns of the two debaters. This is sometimes used as a method for refuting faulty arguments in itself, since once an argument is reconstructed from its main elements, the flaws or faulty premises become more evident, a technique more powerful than one would suspect. One of the goals of the debate playlist is to drill down this approach, so that it may become second nature. The debate has a peculiar start. Both debaters give their opening statements. Peterson criticizes Marxism head-on, starting from the Communist Manifesto, while Žižek instead gives an overview of his thoughts on happiness, capitalism, and current trends. It becomes quite evident that the debaters had different ideas on how the discussion would occur. Peterson thought that he would defend capitalism, and that Žižek would defend Marxism.
For me, the terms of the argument were, well, there were three terms of the argument, let's say. There was capitalism, there was Marxism, and there was happiness. And I would say Dr. Žižek focused probably more on the problems of capitalism and the problems of happiness than on the utility of Marxism. And that actually comes as a surprise to me, because I presumed that much of what I would hear would be a support of something approximating traditional or even a-traditional Marxism, which is why I organized the first part of my talk as an attack against Marxism per se.
While Žižek was more in search of a broad discussion on modern society and its structures, he wasn't really interested in a complete formal defense of Marxism, a theory in which he himself also sees some problems.
On many points, I agree with you, and it's a very complex argument. Marx didn't have, for example, a good theory of how social power exists. His idea was simply, with disappearance of class structure, it's secretly, although he wouldn't have accepted it, a technocratic dream.
Thus, the only real back and forth on Marxism will revolve around whether equality of outcomes was an aim of the doctrine.
I also heard an argument for egalitarianism, but I heard it defined as equality of opportunity, not as equality of outcome, which I see as a clearly defined Marxist aim.
A claim that Žižek will explicitly deny.
There is one passage in his late critique of Gotha program where Marx directly accesses the problem of equality, and he dismisses it as a strict bourgeois category. Explicitly. For him, communism is not egalitarianism.
Peterson will have the last word.
You argued that Marx wasn't a believer in equality of outcome, and I'm not so sure about that, because his notion of the eventual utopia that would constitute genuine communism was a place where all class divisions were eradicated.
But
and so there's at
hierarchies.
Well, there's at least an implication that the most important of the hierarchies had disappeared. And so maybe he had enough sophistication to talk about other forms of hierarchies, but if that's the case, then I can't imagine why he thought that the utopia that would emerge as a consequence of the elimination of economic hierarchies would be a utopia. Because if there were other forms of hierarchies that still existed, people would be just as contentious about them as they are now. Like we have hierarchies of attractiveness, for example, that have nothing to do with economics or very little to do with economics, and there's no shortage of contention around that.
The main bulk of the discussion will be on the subject of capitalism. Žižek identifies two main threats. One he calls internal.
Moral degradation, sexual promiscuity, consumerist hedonism, and so on are the outcome of the immanent dynamic of capitalist societies. The turn towards culture as a key component of capitalist reproduction and, concomitant to it, the commodification of cultural life itself are, I think, crucial moments of capitalist expanded reproductions.
And the other threat he calls external.
The threat of ecological catastrophe, the consequence of new technoscientific developments, especially in biogenetics, and new forms of apartheid. There is a problem with capitalism here for the simple reason that its managers, not because of their evil nature, but that's the logic of capitalism, care to expand self-reproduction, and environmental consequences are simply not part of the game.
For these reasons, capitalism needs some limitations.
I know it's provocative to call this a plea for communism. I do it a little bit to provoke things. But what is needed is nonetheless in all these spheres, I claim, ecology, digital control, unity of the world, capitalist market, which does great things, I admit it, has to be somehow limited, regulated, and so on. Before you say it's a utopia, I will tell you, but just think about in what way global market already functions today. I always thought that neoliberalism is a fake term. If you look closely, you will see that state plays today more important role than ever precisely in the richest capitalist economies. So, you know, the market is already limited, but not in the right way, to put it naively.
Bernt Peterson will give his response.
Much of what I heard I agreed with. As Winston Churchill said about democracy, you know, it's the worst form of government there is, except for all the other forms. And so you might say the same thing about capitalism, is that it's the worst form of economic arrangement you could possibly manage, except for every other one that we've ever tried. He said, well, what's the problems with capitalism? Well, the commodification of cultural life, all life, fair enough. There's something that isn't exactly right about reducing everything to economic competition. And capitalism certainly pushes in that direction. And it's certainly the case that the radical wealth production that characterizes capitalism might produce a fatal threat to the structure of our social systems and our broader ecosystems. And it's also not a message that I have been purveying that unbridled capitalism per se, as an isolated, what would you say, social economic structure, actually constitutes the proper answer to the problems that confront us.
It appears that there actually is substantial agreement between the two. Capitalism, but with accurate limitations to patch its problems. Although Žižek is a bit more pessimistic on the possibility that the limitations will be implemented in time.
The truly dangerous thing in China today is not to flirt with Western ideas, is to organize trade unions, this is what worries me. This perfect combination between unleashing capitalism and still the authoritarian rule, or to put it in another way, my worry is that today, all around the world, this eternal marriage between capitalism and democracy is slowly disappearing. So, a pessimist conclusion. What will happen? In spite of protests here and there, we will probably continue to slide towards some kind of apocalypse, awaiting large catastrophes to awaken us. So I don't accept any cheap optimism. When somebody tries to convince me that in spite of all the problems, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, my instant reply is yes. And it's probably another train coming towards us.
The next major discussion will be on labels.
Your reputation, unless I'm very misinformed about this, is as a strong supporter of Marxist doctrines on the left, or was that? And so then my question is, given the originality of your thought, why is it that you came to presume at some point in your life, perhaps not now and perhaps still, that the promotion of Marxism rather than Zizekism was appropriate? There's just no reason for you to be allied with a doctrine that's 170 years old and that is, if capitalism is rife with problems, is twice as rife with problems as that. And so you're kind of a mystery to me in that way. And so that's my question.
Although Žižek holds Marx in great esteem and thinks some of his insights were brilliant, he seems to be for the most part fine in changing the label from Marxist to more of a Hegelian.
I developed systematically in my book critical insights into many traditional Marxist theses, so no doubt here. You know what I still admire nonetheless in Marx? Not those simplicities of Communist Manifesto, but I still think that his so-called critique of political economy, Capital, and so on, is a tremendous achievement as a description of the dynamics of capitalist society. Forget Communist Manifesto, go to read his political analysis of its unsurpassable 18 Brumaire and so on of the 1848 revolution, which are incredibly complex, no traces of that class binary there. Marx deals with middle classes with crucial, lumpen proletariat with the ambiguous role of intellectuals and so on and so on. But basically, what I was pleading for, and I like to put it in paradoxical terms, was for a return from Marx back to Hegel. I define myself more as a Hegelian.
Peterson would thus encourage him to not use the Marxist label anymore.
I think the unfortunate reality is that any support for Marxism, especially directed towards those who are young, is likely to be read as support for the most radical and revolutionary proclivities. And I would say that as they're outlined in the document that I described, in the Communist Manifesto, that they're of extraordinary danger. And so it seems to me that by attempting to, rescue the sheep, you've sort of invited the dragon into the house.
But since we are on the topic of labels, Žižek has a couple of questions of his own.
Postmodern neo-Marxism. Where is really the Marxist element in it? They are for equality. Sorry, where? They are for equality at these cultural struggles, proper names, how do we call each other? Do you see in them, in political correctness and so on, any genuine will to change society? I don't see it. I think it's a hyper-moralization, which is a silent admission of a defeat. Who are these postmodern, egalitarian, neo-Marxist, and where do you see any kind even of Marxism? I see in it mostly an impotent, an utterly impotent moralization.
Here Žižek is referring to the label postmodern neo-Marxist that is often utilized by Peterson, who will start off by explaining who he believes the postmodern neo-Marxists are.
Organization like Jonathan Haidt's, what's it called? Heterodox Academy, and other organizations like that have documented an absolute dearth of conservative voices in the social sciences and the humanities, and about 25%, according to the what I think are reliable surveys, approximately 25% of social scientists in the US identify themselves as Marxists.
Then he will clarify what he means with the label.
Well, yeah, your question seemed to me to focus more on the peculiar relationship that I've noticed and that people have disputed between postmodernism and neo-Marxism. And I see the connection between the postmodernist types and the Marxists as a sleight of hand that replaced the notion of the oppression of the proletariat by the bourgeoisie as the oppression by one identity group by another.
Totally agree with you.
Okay, so I think what happened, especially in France in the 1960s, is as the radical Marxist postmodern types like Derrida and Foucault realized that they were losing the moral battle, especially after the information came out of the Soviet Union in the manner that it came out. That the whole bloody Stalinist, the whole Stalinist catastrophe, along with the entire Maoist catastrophe, that they didn't really have a leg to stand on. And instead of revising their notion that human history, and this is a Marxist notion, should be regarded as the eternal class struggle between the economically deprived and the oppressors, they just recast it and said, well, it's not based on economics, it's based on identity, but it's still fundamentally oppressor against oppressed. And to me, that meant that they smuggled the fundamental narrative of Marxism and many of its goals back into the argument without ever admitting that they did so.
But Žižek sees a contradiction in terms.
But that's precisely a non-Marxist gesture par excellence.
What Žižek is probably getting at here is that postmodernism posits that there are no grand narratives, while Marxism employs a materialist interpretation of historical development, historical materialism, that is a narrative of its own. Peterson tells us that he is conscious of this objection, and provides a quick explanation.
People who are postmodernists say, look, one of the hallmarks of postmodernism is skepticism of meta-narratives. It's like, I know that perfectly well. And I also know that Marxism is a meta-narrative, and so you shouldn't be able to be a postmodernist and a Marxist. But I still see the union of those two things in the insistence that the appropriate way to look at the world is to view it as the battleground between groups defined by a particular between individuals defined by a particular group identity, so that the group identity becomes paramount, and then the proper reading is always oppressor versus oppressed. With a secondary insistence that's very similar to Marx's insistence upon the moral superiority of the proletariat, that the oppressors are by definition, because they're oppressed, morally superior. And there's the call for perhaps not revolutionary change, although that comes up above, but change in the structure so that that oppression disappears, so that a certain form of equality comes about.
We then jump to the last macro argument, that revolves around the emphasis on personal responsibility present in Jordan Peterson's work.
Why do you put so much access to this? We have to begin with the personal change. I mean, this is also the second or which one, I don't remember, forgive me, of your slogans in your book. You know, first set your house in order, then. But I have an extremely common sense, naive question here. But what if in trying to set your house in order, you discover that your house is in disorder precisely because the way the society is messed up? To say to somebody in North Korea, set your house in order, no? Haha. But I think in some deeper sense, it goes also for our societies. I'm just repeating what you are telling. You see some kind of a social crisis, and I don't see clearly why to insist so much on this choice.
To which Jordan Peterson gives his reasons for focusing on the individual level.
One of my favorite quotes from Carl Jung, it's actually a quote that I used at the beginning of my first book, which was called Maps of Meaning, was that if you take a personal problem seriously enough, you will simultaneously solve a social problem. And so let's say right now there's tremendous tension between men and women in the West. And then if you do establish a relationship with a woman, you are instantly faced with all of the sociological problems in a microcosm in that relationship. And then if you work those damn problems out, if you can work them out within your relationship, then you can get some insight. It's not complete insight, but you can get some partial insight into what the problem actually is and get the diagnosis right, and you've moved some small measure forward in addressing what might constitute the broader social concern. And what's even better, you're punished for your own goddamn mistakes. And that's another thing I like about the idea of working locally, is that, you know, if I do broad-scale social experiments and they fail, it's like, well, tough luck for the people for whom they failed. But if I'm experimenting on myself within the confines of my own relationship and I make a mistake, I'm going to feel the pain. And that's good, that's just, but it also gives me the possibility of learning. And so I believe that you do solve what you can about yourself first before you can set your family straight and before you should dare to try to set the world straight.
The two debaters were very charitable and agreeable with one another, although the patterns of speech of one of them could sometimes make it a bit confusing to understand where the argument was going. Instead, the substantial elements discussed thoroughly were not that many compared to the length of the exchange. In part because of the different approaches the two debaters had to the discussion, in part because the format was not that free-flowing, and much of the initial statements were left undiscussed. I found the debate a bit messy but entertaining, and was surprised by the amount of agreement there was on the economic system to employ moving forward. I was also warm to a great deal of what Jordan Peterson said about the Communist Manifesto, but I think his criticism is more appropriate as thought as a criticism towards the more populist interpretations of Marxist thought. Indeed, I believe it's not a coincidence that his points are based on a manifesto that often has to simplify much of the nuance to be accessible to a wider public. For the sake of completeness, if one is curious to hear an extensive rebuttal to Peterson's critique, taken as a critique of Marxism as a theory, there is a video on CCK's Philosophy's YouTube channel that I'll link in the description. For full disclosure, I don't know much about Marxism, and I believe that putting capitalism in a historical/statistical context shows its merits. Jordan Peterson's points on the matter resonated well with me, as they did with Žižek, but I found the rebuttal on CCK's Philosophy's channel at the very least worth listening to give one a more complete picture on the matter. Moving on. While watching the debate, I was amused by a connection between Žižek, Peterson, and Indian philosopher Krishnamurti. In his own thought, Krishnamurti mirrors Žižek's criticism of Jordan Peterson's self-help philosophy by claiming that it's no measure of health to be adjusted to a profoundly sick society. But at the same time, he mirrors Jordan Peterson's defense of his approach by focusing first on individual change. That's it, don't have much more to say. If I do, I'll write other thoughts in the video description.